Well, Keith, greetings from Kabul, Afghanistan, where the U.S. Ambassador Carl Eikenberry.
This is a story about the seen and the unseen, and about things hidden in plain sight.
First of all, let me just congratulate Jeremy on what I think is not just an extraordinarily made film, but an extremely important film. Probably one of the most important political films of the last 20 years. A lot of times as a journalist, actually most of the time as a journalist, I am extremely embarrassed by the behavior of my fellow journalists inside the United States, and embarrassed that I bear that title. But after watching that film, I'm extremely proud to be a journalist. And the reason I say that is because journalism at its best, the reason why it's a noble profession and an important profession, is because what it really involves is people taking great risks to tell us and show us the things we ought to know about what the people who wield the most power are doing, especially when those people are trying to hide that from us. And the film that we all just watched is nothing but somebody, namely Jeremy and Rick Riley, taking extraordinary risks, going to places around the world over and over and over again that most Western journalists, even brave ones, are very afraid to go, in order to show us things and tell us stories that we absolutely must know about and yet would not know about if not for the bravery of Jeremy and the people who made this film. And I hope that we all can take a moment to recognize that as much as we all love to hate journalists and the media, when it's done right, it is an extraordinarily important function that it plays for all of us. A lot of the film is obviously very graphic. There are things that I bet some people think might have been best not shown. Things of looking at dead children, corpses that have been mutilated beyond recognition over and over and over again. And I think it's extremely important that the film showed up. And the reason I say that is because in the United States especially, people are somewhat aware that the United States government has been a government at war for the last 12 years in one country after the next. But the reason why Americans don't mind very much, the reason why there's so little protest about it, the reason why there's so little discussion over it, is because usually the truth of what that war is about is kept from the world. We simply don't see the effects of what our behavior, what our choices, what our leaders' conduct is resulting in. And in order for us to have an informed discussion as adults about what our government is doing, to understand the world that we're living in and the choices that we allow, I think it's vitally important that we not talk about things like war in the abstract. The wars that the United States government is fighting, first under George Bush and then under President Obama, are destroying innocent people's lives continuously. And if that's going to be something that Americans or people in the West, where the world is going to tolerate, let alone support, then I think it's our responsibility to be faced with the truth of what that actually means. And I've never seen anything that shows us the truth of what that is, the reality of it, more powerfully and more accurately than this film, which is one of the reasons why I think it's so important. The other issue last point I want to make about why I think this film is so critical and why it's so affecting. I remember I lived in Brazil for more than 8 years, and people always ask me when I do interviews, I'm like, American journalists, well, what have you learned from living in Brazil? What does it do to your perspective to live in a foreign country? And it's a little bit difficult to really say, but I do remember this one experience that I had maybe a year or so after I was living here. I was just walking outside, kind of reflecting on things without a plan, and all of a sudden I realized that all the time I'm reading Brazilian newspapers, I'm watching Brazilian news programs, I'm talking to people about Brazilian politics, and it all of a sudden hit me that there's never a moment in any of those discussions where people say, which country should we go bomb next? Like, which country should we go? This thing does not exist. And as an American, that was really strange to me. I realized that this was something extremely different about Brazilian political culture than I was used to. And then after that, I realized that what was strange was not that Brazil and Brazilian political discussion doesn't entail questions of which country should we bomb now. What's really strange is that American political discourse always involves that discussion. It's never a question of should we be at war. It's really a question of which country should we bomb or invade next. And if you listen to Americans talk about terrorism, whenever there's a new terrorist attack like took place in Boston several months ago, the question that always arises and that Americans always ask over and over again is, why would anybody ever possibly have enough hatred in their heart for the United States that they would want to attack us? It's as though we simply go about our business, minding our own business, simply wanting peace in the world, and these very strange and bizarre people, because of their primitive and extreme religion, and they're basically they must be crazy, decide out of nowhere that they want to attack us. And one of the truths, probably one of the most significant truths that is kept from the American people and simply excluded from political discourse in the United States is the point that this film makes more importantly than any other, which is that if you're going to be a country that goes around the world continuously dropping bombs on other people and killing whomever you want and destroying whatever you want and acting without constraints, then there's a price to pay for that. If you're going to go around the world and kill people's children and go into their homes at night and murder their pregnant wives and sisters and daughters and mothers, you're going to be creating huge numbers of people around the world who are going to want to get revenge on you. That's just basic human nature. If you look at what Americans did after one single attack 12 years ago on American soil, it led to 12 years of bloodshed and vengeance and a desire for violence. Think about what constant American violence in the rest of the world, not on one day, but continuously, over and over and over again for 12 years, torture and kidnapping and rendition and drone killing and night raids and bombings. Think about the kinds of prices that Americans will have to pay in terms of the emotions that it's generating. You saw that one scene where the man who lost numerous family members in one night said, all I wanted to do was go and kill Americans. That scene is repeating itself over and over and over again, and it's critical that Americans start thinking about, when they think about terrorism, not just that there are crazy people in the world who want to kill them, but that there's a causal link, a price to pay between the policies they keep endorsing and the threat that they say they want to stop. And I think this film, more than anything I've ever seen before, really highlights that. So congratulations again, Jeremy.
As you know, David Miranda was detained unlawfully by the British government at Heathrow Airport and held for more than 9 hours, denied access to a lawyer of his choosing, and he was targeted because of who his partner is. And it was really an epic low moment in a long history of the U.S. attacking journalists to go after someone's partner in that way and to hold him under an anti-terrorism law. This is a university student from Brazil who loves to go to clubs and hang out. He was hardly a member of Al-Qaeda. And yet they targeted David Miranda in this way, really in an effort to attack and intimidate Glenn. And what I know from knowing both of these men is that every time these governments attack them, it just makes them more bold or emboldened to want to continue the reporting and to not back down in the face of these attacks. I consider Glenn Greenwald right now the world's journalist. I don't refer to him as an American journalist writing for a British newspaper based in the United States. There's been this attack line against Glenn that he's somehow living in a gay paradise in Rio, that he's afraid to come back to the United States, that he is seeking fame. David and Glenn have paid a heavy price for the reporting that Glenn has done, and I think everyone around the world owes them a debt of gratitude, because it's not just Glenn. This takes family and friends and loved ones to support this kind of work. I also want to say that the stories that Glenn has been breaking, along with Laura Poitras, the journalist who's based in Berlin, it is the single most important story of our time. Many people try to dismiss it and say, oh, we already knew that. You see, the way the world has changed is that you have evidence, and it spurs people to action. And whistleblowers like Edward Snowden, who is now in Moscow, give courage to other potential whistleblowers. Part of the message of our film is that this is the future of what will be happening here in South America and throughout Latin America, Central America, because America always finds a way to have its wars. And it's a war against communism, it's a war against drugs, it's a war against terror. But what all of these wars really are is counterinsurgency in an attempt to defend corporate capitalist interests. And the war on drugs, as the United States and its allies in Latin America call it, really is counterinsurgency. And the Brazilian government, its forces receive training from US military special operations forces. They work closely with the Central Intelligence Agency. Certainly ahead of the World Cup and the Olympics, Brazil will be working with the very people that President Dilma was attacking at the United Nations. I agree with her position at the UN. I think Brazil has every right, and all Brazilians have every right to be outraged at what the US government has been doing to you, to your personal lives, to companies in Brazil, to Brazilian elected officials and political figures. It was an extraordinary moment watching Brazil's president open the United Nations General Assembly as the first speaker, and to spend the overwhelming majority of her time attacking the most powerful nation in the world. And Obama followed her. Obama was the next speaker after her, and I'm told that President Obama was in his car during the speech and wasn't listening to it. I think the reason was not out of disrespect. I think it's because the NSA had already read her speech and they knew what she was going to say. You know, one of the things about our film is that we focus on this issue of the US government assassinating American citizens. And I want to say clearly and for the record, I do not believe that American lives are worth more than non-American lives. All human lives are equal. But how a nation treats its own citizens is a good indication of how it views the rest of you. If the United States will allow the president to act as an emperor, to serve as the prosecutor, the judge, the jury, and the executioner in a trial that didn't exist, with charges that were never filed, then how do you think they view ordinary Pakistanis, Afghans, Yemenis? Those lives are worth nothing to them. And so we have the most powerful nation in the world with the popular Democratic president who won the Nobel Peace Prize, who's a constitutional lawyer, standing up at the United Nations and essentially saying, America is an empire, and we will take natural resources from across the world using our military might. He gave a bold imperialist declaration at the United Nations and seemed to have no reservations in doing so. I believe that if a Republican was in office right now in the United States, John McCain or Mitt Romney, that liberal Americans would be in the streets calling for their impeachment. But they're cheerleading President Obama simply because he's a Democrat. What that means is that they've ceded, they've given their conscience to a political figure. They're engaged in cult-like support for the leader of the country. One of the fundamental ways that dictatorships are separated from free societies is a free and vibrant media. President Obama's administration is waging a war against journalists and a war against journalism. They are going after whistleblowers, charging them under the Espionage Act. They are naming journalists in criminal indictments. They are surveilling the communications of journalists, not just in the United States, but around the world. As you saw in the film, Mr. Nobel Peace Prize winner Obama intervened to keep a Yemeni journalist locked up in prison. There's a war against journalists, and we are all now living in a surveillance state that is run by the most powerful nations in the world. The connections between war and surveillance are clear. I don't want to give too much away, but Glenn and I are working on a project right now that has at its center how the National Security Agency plays a significant central role in the US assassination program. And finally, I want to say that while I agree completely with Brazil's position on the NSA, I want to reiterate my call for the attacks against pro-democracy activists to stop here in Brazil. Stop with the police brutality and the violence. Stop targeting people who are trying to change their own government. That should be a consistent policy that citizens around the world embrace. And when one society is attacked, all of us should come to its defense.
I think I would like to hear from you guys some reflection about the role of the other governments. We could not expect such extreme level of advancement on the war on terror if you didn't have, if the U.S. didn't have an incredible level of complicity from other governments around the world, both in Europe but also in Asia and Africa. So just it would be good to hear you comment about that. But before that, antes disso eu vou passar.
Jeremy, bom, a minha pergunta serve para o Glenn também. Vocês são alvos móveis, né? Vocês sabem disso, vocês vivem com isso, aprenderam a lidar com isso, né? Vocês, enfim, vocês têm backups humanos, vocês têm outras pessoas que possam ajudar vocês, assim, para que vocês não sejam alvos. Obviamente não estou perguntando quem, mas vocês tomam esse cuidado de fazer o backup das informações com outras pessoas para que o holofote todo, as luzes todas não fiquem em cima de vocês. Não digo as luzes não da mídia, mas as luzes obviamente da National Security. Enfim, vocês correm muito risco de vida, né? Vocês são heróis do jornalista da informação procurando salvar vidas, né? E apesar e a segunda parte da pergunta, na verdade, é: vocês acham que a atuação de vocês ajudou a evitar alguma coisa, diminuir alguma espécie de ataque que poderia acontecer, algum raid, como se fala em inglês, assim, que ia acontecer e por acaso saiu alguma matéria de vocês que tenha salvo vidas? A gente viu muita destruição morte, mas vocês já conseguiram salvar a vida de alguém que vocês têm notícia?
Well, I'm not a superhero. I don't know exactly how to answer the second part of that question. I think that whenever people join together and rise up with one voice to confront powerful, corrupt individuals and institutions, they can save lives, they can make a difference, but it's one of those amazing things in the human experience that it's hard to quantify it. But I do think that the brave work of activists and journalists around the world has been a central part of limiting an already out-of-control national security state, forcing it to defend its actions. The reporting that Glenn and Laura Poitras have been doing has caused the most powerful man in the world, President Obama, to have to speak about this issue and defend it almost every day. Polls in the United States indicate that whistleblower Edward Snowden's approval ratings are higher than the U.S. Congress right now. And I think that's because of the bravery of whistleblowers and the work of journalists. As for my own security, I'll answer first when it comes to digital security. I know Glenn and I both, over these years, Glenn in particular recently, have had to take extreme measures to protect our sources, to protect our data. Any journalist who covers these issues that is not using serious encryption and is not thinking of the safety of the people that they're talking to who are giving them information is a reckless, irresponsible individual at this point. We know the actions of the state. We know that they are monitoring journalists, going after whistleblowers, prosecuting people in record numbers who dare to provide independent information to journalists. When it comes to physical safety, this may sound like a flip comment, but I don't want to ever give those bastards the satisfaction of thinking that they've gotten to me at all. And so I ignore them, because what could I do anyway to stop them? You know, I won't allow it to paralyze my work, and I know Glenn feels the same way. At the end of the day, what really is happening in this war on journalists that Obama's administration is waging is that they're sending a message that the only information that should be published is official leaks from us, or our pronouncements in front of podiums at the White House or in the halls of Congress. That's not a democratic society. That's state media. That's propaganda. And it's sophisticated because Mr. Nobel Peace Prize winner, constitutional law professor, is the one doing it. But the next time a George Bush-like figure is in power in the United States, all of these sheep who followed Obama off the cliff of our values are going to have no ground to stand on in criticizing a Republican. So my hope for the work I'm doing, for the work Glenn is doing, is that it will wake people up, particularly in the United States. We have a special responsibility. Obama likes to talk about America being the exceptional nation in the world. Okay, if that's true, then American citizens have an exceptional responsibility to hold the criminals in their own government responsible.
Eu quero perguntar, na verdade, para os três, ou para quem quiser responder, se a gente está lidando, então, com um novo tipo de guerra. E se o modo como se o modo como nós travamos as guerras muda, então o modo como as concebemos também muda. E se a guerra moderna está subvertendo, então, a noção que a gente tem de guerra clássica. Não existem mais custos políticos quando não está à mostra quantas pessoas estão morrendo, principalmente americanos, enfim. E quais os grandes desafios do direito humanitário internacional em lidar com esses novos atores no teatro de operações de guerra?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question and an important question, and I think you're absolutely right. One of the reasons that this has gone on for so long is because most Americans pay no price. So if you look at the wars of the past that have been pretty controversial, like the Vietnam War, where there were thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and then millions of people literally in the streets protesting, the reason was that it was people's sons and brothers and husbands being sent off thousands of miles away to die in this war by the thousands and thousands. The wars that are fought now in the United States are fought by a very tiny percentage of the population who are actually effective and who stay deployed for huge numbers of years. And on top of that, there's almost never any violence brought to the United States. The violence is all from the United States sent to the rest of the world. So then the question becomes, well, how is it that you can get Americans whose government is waging this war, or as was said earlier, Western governments around the world too, in the UK and throughout Western Europe, who also are rarely affected. How do you get them to stop their own governments from doing these wars if they pay no price? And for me, the answer is films like this. It really is. And the reason I say that is because human beings, by and large, are decent. We're all complicated people. We all have good and evil sides. None of us, very few of us, is purely good or purely evil. But people have consciences, and you can appeal to those that conscience. So if you can hide from a population the slaughter and the destruction and the death of innocent people that you're constantly causing as a government, you can get them not to care about the war. You simply keep scaring them about terrorism and the terrorists and the evil people who want to kill them. But if they're forced to confront the children whose lives are destroyed continuously by the bombs that their government is dropping, that they're paying for, or forced to think about the reasons why there are so many people in the world who want to do violence to the United States. It's not some irrational religion that causes it. It's not that huge numbers of people in the world woke up one day and just randomly picked the United States out of a bag as the country they're going to hate. There's an actual cause behind it, and the cause is the policies that the population supports. If you can get them to start thinking about that, and most of all, to confront the consequences, the moral consequences of their actions, I really do believe that that is the key to getting people to stop these wars, notwithstanding the point that you made, which is that they're not actually paying a price. Of course, ultimately, they are actually paying a price. Americans are paying enormous amounts of money to prop up this huge war machine, to prop up the surveillance state, to build this massive apparatus that puts huge amounts of money into the pockets of defense corporations. They just don't realize that price. They're also paying huge amounts of money because the reason there are so many people who want to do harm to them is because of these policies as well. But even beyond the actual harm that's being done to them, I think you can appeal to people's consciences by showing them
the moral reality of what they're supporting, and that's why I think this film is so crucial.
Oi, meu nome é Caroline. A pergunta que eu queria fazer para vocês era, em relação agora a esse novo dilema que os Estados Unidos está tendo em relação à intervenção militar na Síria e essa resolução na ONU que eles estão fazendo com a Rússia para a entrega do presidente sírio das armas químicas que tem no país. Eu queria saber um pouco da opinião de vocês, o que vocês acham em relação a isso e que tipo de consequências teriam se uma intervenção militar realmente acontecesse lá no país.
First of all, I think that Bashar al-Assad is a war criminal who should be tried for his war crimes. I also believe that the United States has no business militarily intervening in what is a civil war inside of Syria, any more than it already is. The United States, Russia, Iran, Turkey, Qatar, and Hezbollah out of Lebanon are already deeply involved with Syria's civil war. The United States, when Democrats are in power, they sort of have what I call cruise missile liberals, where they believe that they can handle all the crises of the world by lobbing missiles at countries. And really, it's a collective act of intimidation that the United States is using. And there's a selective declaration of who is a war criminal or a butcher, who is like Hitler, and who is a great ally of the United States. The brutality of the Saudi government toward its own citizens is clear, and yet the U.S. bows before the altar of the Saudis. The Israelis are occupying in a very brutal way Palestinian lands, assassinating Palestinians, and yet it is a non-starter in the United States for a politician to say anything critical of Israel. If you look at Syria's neighbor, Iraq, you see what U.S. intervention looks like. They'll always try to cloak it with the shroud of humanitarianism or legality or legitimacy. But the fact is that the United States refuses, under Democrats and Republicans, to ratify an international criminal court. International criminal courts are for other nations, not the United States. And until the United States takes seriously the idea that its officials can also be war criminals, that its soldiers can also be war criminals, there's no legitimacy that the United States can claim in declaring this regime a tyrant dictatorship and this regime somehow an ally of the free world. The U.S. has no credibility. But I believe that if we had a robust system of international law that the United States respected, not only when it's convenient for American interests, or what are perceived or declared to be American interests, but actually had jurisdiction over every nation equally, then we could take more seriously the idea that the world has a responsibility to confront Bashar al-Assad and the brutality of his regime. Let's remember, too, that there are al-Qaeda elements among the Syrian opposition, that the CIA is already giving weapons to the opposition, and we know that in the past the U.S. has funded organizations, armed organizations, that later go on to commit acts of terrorism. And I think that the U.S. is running dangerously close to repeating history in its operations in Syria and in Libya.
Aqui, primeiramente, expressar minha gratidão pelo trabalho de vocês, um exemplo para qualquer ser humano de integridade, de coragem. Acho que faz muita diferença o que vocês fazem, para deixar a gente acordado. A minha pergunta é em relação à construção do martelo, que está sempre querendo um prego para martelar. Ou seja, os Estados Unidos criam suas próprias guerras. E no caso dessas guerras, depois do ano 2000, está muito claro que todas elas são direcionadas ao controle da matriz energética do petróleo. E o governo americano, ele é o principal cliente das empresas de petróleo. A indústria bélica americana é o principal cliente das indústrias de petróleo. Então parece um ganha-ganha no qual as empresas de petróleo ganham, o governo americano ganha e o mundo inteiro perde. Portanto, você acha que nesse momento de agora não seria um ato de cidadania mundial se nós levássemos cada vez mais a sério a questão da energia alternativa para buscar diversificar a matriz energética do mundo e essas guerras percam cada vez mais o grau de relevância que elas têm? Se essa luta não é uma luta direta contra esse poder que subjuga a a soberania de cada cidadão desse mundo. E gostaria de saber a opinião de vocês sobre isso e se existe algum tipo de movimento para tentar disclosure, tentar mostrar essa relação espúria que existe entre as empresas de petróleo e o financiamento de campanha dos governos americanos, talvez também os grandes bancos envolvidos nesse processo.
The reason why the United States has such a great interest in that region of the world continuously is because there's huge amounts of oil there. So as we were just talking about before with Syria, every government, whenever they start a war, no government ever stands up and says, we're about to embark on this war because it's really important to us to dominate and conquer other countries and to control the world's resources. Nobody ever says that. They always stand up and say, we have to wage this war to put an end to evil, to protect innocent people. And if you look at every single war that has been ever fought, including the war in Iraq, which George Bush said when he was selling it was necessary to protect the Iraqi people from horrible oppression and from Saddam gassing his own people. If you look even at World War II and what the Nazi regime said when they invaded Czechoslovakia and Austria, they said they were doing it to protect the German minorities from repression. There's always some kind of justification like that. So when we talk about Syria, the fact that it's in the middle of a region which is extremely oil heavy should always be, there should always be an awareness that that is always the first consideration. But it's certainly the case that we have lots of reasons why we should want to explore alternative energy, but I don't agree that that would somehow really undermine the war machine. There are other reasons why the United States wants to dominate the Middle East, including to protect its closest ally, Israel, which plays an extremely important role in American domestic politics. But for exactly the reason that you said as well, war has become its own end. There's huge amounts of money that get made the more and more money is poured into war. Politicians can get more and more power, they can operate with more and more secrecy, and the entire defense industry that feeds off this war will always want war for a reason. So even if you undermine the cause of war in the Middle East with alternative energy supplies, and there's lots of other benefits to that as well, environmentally and others, there would still be this machine looking for some purpose to justify its ongoing militarism and its continued growth. The United States fought a decade worth of covert wars in Central America that served that purpose. They're doing so, as Jeremy's film just demonstrated, in Africa increasingly. They support all kinds of extremist regimes throughout Asia, and even in the Middle East as well, for reasons having nothing to do with oil. So I think it's an important point, but I also think it's important to recognize that this war machine is much bigger than simply trying to control the world's oil resources. That's a huge part of it, but it would by no means end if that ended, because there's so many powerful factions that benefit in so many ways from its continuation. America just has devoted way more money and way more resources than anybody else to spying on the world, but the desire to know what citizens are saying and doing and thinking is a very common desire on the part of power factions everywhere. It has always been the case that anyone who wants to be tyrannical begins by trying to monitor and therefore control what citizens of a country are doing. And I'm really enthused by the discussions of the Brazilian government and the Argentinian government and other governments to start talking about ways to circumvent American control over the internet by building your own infrastructure that doesn't have to go through the United States, or by requiring internet companies like Facebook and Google and Skype to store their data outside of the United States so that it's subject to Brazilian laws as opposed to American laws. But I think it's also very careful, very important to keep in mind that whenever governments, whether it be the US government or the Brazilian government or anybody else, starts talking about regulating the internet, even when they're telling you that it's designed to protect your privacy from the American government, which very well may be true and is an extremely important goal, there's also always the danger that the Brazilian government or any other government or an international institution will want to simply replace the United States as the entity that is monitoring your communications and storing them and analyzing them, rather than putting an end to that completely. And so it's really important, I think, that all of us who care about internet privacy and internet freedom band together globally to make sure that the internet remains what its real promise was always supposed to be, which was this force for liberalization and democratization to enable people to band together in a way to challenge the world's most powerful factions. And the only way that will happen is if states stay out of the internet. The other option is that instead of being this force for extreme good and extreme liberalization, that the internet is on its way to becoming the opposite, which is the most extreme weapon of control and oppression ever created. And we're at this crossroads now, and it's, I think, what Edward Snowden was motivated by. It's what I think the reporting over the last 4 months have been in this country and in other countries have been about, which is, are we as human beings going to band together and insist that the internet be preserved as this incredible, unprecedented tool of freedom and liberalization and allowing people around the world to band together and exchange ideas and explore human creativity in privacy, or is it going to continue to be what the United States and its allies are trying to turn it into, which is the worst, most nightmarish tool of control? And I think it's really important, as we look for options and alternatives to United States control of the internet, that we constantly bear in mind that that danger will exist with any other state or any other institution that's trying to control the internet, even if they're telling you that they're only doing it to protect your privacy.
And there are small pockets in Afghanistan where girls are going to school and where women have greater freedoms and rights than they had before. But in much of the rest of Afghanistan, the lives of women have remained the same when it comes to how men treat them or how those in power treat them. There's still an incredible amount of violence toward women. Women are kept illiterate. And then they have the added issue of a foreign occupation with night raids where women and children are the primary victims in war. And so what the U.S. has done by going into Afghanistan is to take an already hellish existence for many women and somehow, amazingly, manage to make it worse than it was before. So, the issue of women's rights is often used by political figures in the United States to justify a policy that has an aim other than protecting the rights of women. In closing, I just want to say that I think that we've reached a moment in the history of U.S. warfare where we really are seeing a window into our future, where the United States is going to move away from massive, large-scale military occupations and is going to return to an era, much like what Glenn was referencing before, of the dirty wars in Central America. It's part of why we chose this name for our film. Not because we are so stupid as to believe there's a such thing as a clean war. We know there isn't. But what we're seeing is under this popular Democratic president, a return to massive amounts of covert action around the world, a paramilitarization of the Central Intelligence Agency, the use of forces that are not held accountable by the people of the United States elected to hold them accountable, where Democrats and Republicans use the excuse of secrecy to try to protect the citizens from information that the citizens could use to try to change their government or confront unjust policies. And all of us, and I feel like what happened with Glenn Greenwald and Edward Snowden and this NSA story, is that a line was drawn in the sand. And we have a choice of which side of that line we want to stand on. Do we want to stand on the line with the majority of the world's people who want an end to these wars, who don't want to be spied on, who are sick of one nation telling the rest of the world that it is the most exceptional nation and everyone just has to live with whatever declarations whoever happens to be in power offers up for the world? Are we going to stand on the side of people who want real press freedom, not just in the United States, but around the world? Or are we going to stand with the powerful? Are we going to stand with those whose whole interest in life is to make money for their corporate friends and to try to fill their bank accounts up at the expense of everyone else in the world? We're at a turning point in history, and which direction it's going to turn, we don't know yet. But much of the answer depends on how many people decide to make it a part of their daily lives, to be a part of the struggle on this side of the line, on the side of the line in the sand with most of the world's people. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight, and it was a real honor to be here with you in Rio, and thank you to the Film Festival, and all of you, and all of you. Thank you, everyone.